One of the more interesting quirks of the Sonic fanbase is a fascination with the concept of eras. An era is simply a period of time, usually named after one of the most prominent aspects of that time period. For example, the classic era of Sonic, which started in 1991 with the release of the first Sonic game, takes place during the 90s with all of Sonic's old school adventures, like Sonic 2, Sonic CD, and Sonic 3. Over the years, fans have tried to name and define all of the many different eras of Sonic into a nice, distinct, real-world timeline. However, one thing I've realized is that every fan has a different interpretation of where certain eras began and ended, and even if certain time periods should even be considered eras at all. So, let's go through Sonic's history and talk about some of the important points in time. I think probably the least debated era is probably the aforementioned Classic era. This era started in 1991 with Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis and continued on to the release of Sonic Adventure in 1998. We saw a lot of 2D platformers in this era, although eventually 3D games did start to release during this time period, like Sonic the Fighters in 1996. During this time, the series used Sonic's classic design with flatter shoes, black eyes, and a shorter, chubbier look. This era is looked back on quite fondly by new and old fans alike due to its selection of high-quality games and simple, old-school fun. However, this time period is not without its setbacks. When people think of the classic era of Sonic, I believe they mostly think about the first half of it from 1991 to 1994. However, the latter half from about late 1994, maybe early 1995, until the release of Sonic Adventure at the tail end of 1998 is a period of time that's often forgotten by fans. When people think about the classic era, they think about Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles, but they don't think about Knuckles Chaotix and Sonic Labyrinth and Sonic Blast. This was an awkward period of time when the Sonic games lacked direction. They just kinda did stuff. Hey, here's an educational game. Hey, here's some Tails spin-offs. What's that? You want a platformer? Well, here's an isometric platformer. As a result, I like to call this period the awkward phase, or the awkward era of Sonic. Or you could just call it the Saturn era, because this era of Sonic lines up almost perfectly with the lifespan of the Sega Saturn console, up until the release of Sega's next console, the Dreamcast. There are some cool and at the very least interesting games that came out during this era, like Sonic the Fighters and Sonic R, but there was a noticeable drop in quality in this era. So it's not too surprising that this era is often overlooked by fans. Heck, even the series itself doesn't really care about this time period. I mean, how many times have you heard the series reference that one time Eggman snuck into Sonic's house and robbed him? Eggman stole Sonic's shoes and made him wear slowdown boots. There was that one time they released some Sonic Channel artwork of Sonic wearing his slowdown boots, but that's about it. Sega actually released an official Sonic timeline, and none of the games made during this time period were important enough to be included on the timeline. What was important enough to be included on the timeline is Sonic Adventure on the Sega Dreamcast, which started a brand new era of Sonic. When people think about the first true 3D Sonic game, they don't think about Sonic the Fighters or Sonic 3D Blast, they think of Sonic Adventure. Along with 3D platforming action, this game also gave Sonic and several other characters brand new redesigns, and the series began using fully voice-acted cutscenes. This truly was the beginning of a new age. This era lasted from the release of Sonic Adventure in late 1998 until, well, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. The first reason for this is the name of the era. Most people refer to this time period as the Dreamcast era or the Adventure era. However, this doesn't really make a ton of sense because most people would probably say that this era stretches all the way until 2006 when Sonic 06 came out. Calling this era the Dreamcast era or the Adventure era makes you think that this era only encompasses the time in which Sonic games were released on the Sega Dreamcast console or the Sonic games released while the Adventure series was running. Sonic Adventure 2 was both the last Sonic game on the Dreamcast and the last Sonic game in the Adventure series, so both of these names imply that this era ended with Sonic Adventure 2, meaning this era only lasted from 1998 to 2001. Ending this era with the release of Sonic Adventure 2 is actually really fitting, because 2001 was the year that Sega dropped out of the home console market. After Sonic Adventure 2, the Sonic series officially became a free agent. After this point, we saw Sonic games cropping up on Sega's rival company consoles, like Microsoft's Xbox, Sony's PlayStation 2, and even Nintendo's GameCube. There were Sonic games on non-Sega hardware before, like PC, the Neo Geo Pocket Color, and the Gamecom, but they were mostly re-releases and small stuff. Now, we'd be getting big Sonic games like a re-release of Sonic Adventure 2 on the GameCube. So, the first game in this next era would be Sonic Advance, a new 2D Sonic platformer on the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. Technically, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle came out on the same day as Sonic Advance. They both released on December 20th, 2001, but 2 Battle is a re-release, so we're just gonna ignore that. Now, what about the endpoint for this era? Well, we could keep the original endpoint of the Adventure era, which I would think most people would say is 2006 when Sonic 06 was released. A thought-provoking question is, what do we call this era from 2001 to 2006? Maybe the multi-platform era, since this was the time when Sonic started popping up on a ton of different consoles from rival companies? Maybe the Advance era, of course because this era started with Sonic Advance, but then again, calling it the Advance era has the same problem as calling everything from 1998 to 2006 the Adventure era or the Dreamcast era. The Advance series ended in 2004 with Sonic Advance 3, so we've still got time from 2004 to 2006 that's unaccounted for. I think for now we'll go with the Advance era, because the multi-platform era it doesn't really roll off the tongue quite as well. Now, the name for the next era starting in 2006 is quite interesting. At one point, people referred to this as the modern era, but I don't know if you've checked your calendar lately, but 2006 was almost 20 years ago, so it might be time for a different name for this point in time. For a long time, many fans referred to this period as the Dark Ages, probably because this was around the time when a lot of poorly received games were released. But it also could be because the series did become a bit darker and edgier at this point, after already becoming a bit darker during the Adventure era. Another name I've heard for this period is the HD era, as this was the point in time when the Sonic series began releasing games on the PS3 and Xbox 360, which were both HD consoles. I think calling this period the Dark Ages, while a little mean, is pretty fitting, especially if you push the start of this era a little earlier with the release of Shadow the Hedgehog in 2005. Shadow 05 is one of, if not the darkest Sonic game, with guns, cursing, and some implied deaths. This also makes calling the last era the Advance era a bit more fitting, because using Shadow 05 as the starting point of this new era means the Advance era only lasted from 2001 to 2005 instead of 2001 to 2006. The last Advance game came out in 2004, so there was a bit less of a gap between the last Advance game and the start of the new era. Besides, the most noteworthy game to even come out between Advance 3 and Shadow 05 was Sonic Gems Collection. I love Gems Collection, but I mean, come on, it's just a compilation, so we aren't exactly missing much from the latter half of 2004 and most of 2005 anyway. I also think Shadow 05 makes for a better start to this era because this is the first game in the series to use the English voice cast from the 4Kids dub of the Sonic X anime. Starting with Sonic Adventure, the series had a fairly consistent game voice cast, composed of actors like Ryan Drummond, Jennifer Doolittle, and the late Dean Bristow. However, Shadow 05 was when the series went full 4Kids, bringing in the actors from Sonic X, like Jason Griffith, Lisa Ortiz, and Mike Pollock. So maybe we should call this the 4Kids era. This is great because you could easily say that this era ended when the 4Kids cast was replaced in 2010. The only issue with this name though is that this is only a change with the English dub cast. In Japan, the main cast remained virtually the same, with series staples like Junichi Kanamura, Taeko Kawada, and the late Chikao Otsuka all returning. Another possible name I had for this era is the Experimental Era. The Sonic series tried a lot of new and weird things during this era. Of course, you had Shadow 05, which had weapons, vehicles, and a branching story structure. There was the Sonic Storybook series, this weird sub-series developed by Sonic Team where Sonic went to worlds inspired by real-life legends and folklore. Sonic Unleashed had Sonic undergo a crazy new transformation into this werewolf-like form. There was even a Mario and Sonic crossover series that started during this era. This era gave us a ton of strange and interesting new directions for the franchise, so I think calling it the Experimental Era works well. If you thought the previous era of Sonic had a big naming issue, this next era is probably even worse. This era began in 2010 with either the release of Sonic Free Riders or Sonic Colors. Sonic Free Riders was the first game to use the new cast featuring Roger Craig Smith, Cindy Robinson, and Travis Willingham. Sonic Colors was a big game in the series because it was actually well received by fans and critics alike, which was quite rare during the previous era. Colors breathed new life into the franchise by having a simpler story with a lighter tone, cool new Wisp power-ups, and more cohesive gameplay. This makes Colors a great place to mark a brand new era. Now, I have also seen some people say that this era began with Sonic 4 Episode 1, and you know, I don't really have a problem with that. Sonic 4 Episode 1 only came out a month before Sonic Colors, so there isn't that big of a difference in terms of the time frame of when the era began. Sonic 4 Episode 1 is also a pretty good starting point because nostalgia was a big factor of this era. You had the Sonic 4 games, which continued the classic era of Sonic, you had much simpler stories like in the older games, and then of course, you also had Sonic Generations, which was basically one big nostalgia amusement park. So starting off this era with Sonic 4 Episode 1 does make a lot of sense. I would say that this era ended in 2014, lasting all the way until the release of Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric and Shattered Crystal. As for what this era is called, well, the most common name I've heard for this period of time is the Meta Era. To be honest, I've never really vibed with that name. From what I can tell, the reasoning for this name is because this is the time when the series became more meta or self-referential, and I can understand that. But I think calling it the Nostalgia Era is more fitting, as I think it better represents what the period was all about. Another name I've heard for this time is the Colors Era, for obvious reasons, but I think the name the Colors Era has another meaning as well. Like the Experimental Era, aka the Dark Era, was the time when the series became a bit more dark, I think this era in the early 2010s was a time when the series became a lot more colorful. Everything was bright, goofy, and silly in this era. I could honestly go with either the Nostalgia Era or the Colors Era, but I think I'm gonna go with the Nostalgia Era. The next era began in 2014 with the Sonic Boom games. The Sonic series changed drastically in this era, with brand new redesigns for the main cast. There was also a new TV show to go along with these two games. So the easy name for this age is the Boom Era. Technically, the Sonic Boom games are considered spin-offs in a separate universe, so defining the entire game franchise by these games may seem a bit drastic, but let's be honest, what other Sonic games were coming out in the mid-2010s? Mario and Sonic at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games? Sonic Runner's Adventure? Come on. The period from 2014 to 2016 was basically all Boom. Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, Sonic Boom Shattered Crystal, Sonic Dash 2, Sonic Boom Fire and Ice. There really wasn't much else going on unless it was related to Sonic Boom. I think it's safe to say that the Boom era is over, since we haven't gotten any more Boom-related games. After the end of the Boom era, we got another nostalgia theme park ride in Sonic Mania, a return to the boost formula in Sonic Forces, and a brand new open-world game in Sonic Frontiers. Frontiers has a completely new style of gameplay, which is usually a big indicator of a new era. So if we consider Frontiers to be the starting point of a new era, what do we call the period from 2017 to 2022? There really wasn't much to talk about during that 5-year gap between Forces and Frontiers. The most noteworthy Sonic-related thing that came out during this era was the Sonic movie franchise, the first 2 films released during this time. Game-wise, all we got was another racing game, a Colors remaster, and another compilation. The only super notable games were Mania and Forces, which came out at the very beginning of the era. Maybe we could call this time period the False Start Era. Oh, actually, I have an idea. Let's call it the Phantom Era. 1, because like a phantom, this era doesn't really exist. There weren't a ton of big games outside of the very start of the era. And 2, because the key object in Sonic Mania and Sonic Forces was the Phantom Ruby, this weird reality-bending stone. Of course, that brings us to the current era started by Sonic Frontiers. Since Frontiers came out, we've gotten a detective mystery game, another throwback game in Sonic Superstars, a mobile 3D platformer in Sonic Dream Team, and of course the updated remaster of Sonic Generations, which included the new Shadow Generations campaign. So far, I'd say that this has honestly been a pretty good era for Sonic. As for what we could call this era, again, not too sure. Because of the better games coming out and the positively received movies, I've seen a lot of people call this the Renaissance era. To be fair, I think it is a solid name. The franchise has been in a really good place for the last few years. Outside of the improved quality, there really isn't any defining feature of this period that we're in now. We've seen a variety of different game types and styles. Although, now that I think about it, there is something else that we could call this era: the lore era. Starting with Sonic Frontiers, the series really began to take its continuity very seriously. This era is more about establishing a consistent lore with callbacks, references, and tie-ins to older entries in the series, and even the Sonic comics. The early 2010s were also heavily invested in the past, but that was more about nostalgia, while this era is more about making a new story by building upon the lore of the past. So yeah, I think that's it for all of the eras. My list of eras is the Classic Era from 1991 to 1995, the Awkward Era from 1995 to 1998, the Adventure Era from 1998 to 2001, the Advance Era from 2001 to 2005, the Experimental Era from 2005 to 2010, the Nostalgia Era from 2010 to 2014, the Boom Era from 2014 to 2017, the Phantom Era from 2017 to 2022, and the Lore Era from 2022 to the present day, which is 2025 as of the time I'm writing this. This is just my personal list of how I separate the Sonic eras in my head, so feel free to disagree in the comments. Even I have some issues with this list. Like, where do you delineate between the end of the Classic Era and the beginning of the Awkward Era? In the past, I deemed Sonic and Knuckles as the endpoint of the Classic Era, and everything after that until Sonic Adventure to be the Awkward Era. But that would mean Sonic Triple Trouble is included in the Awkward Era, and I don't really know if that game fits. Triple Trouble feels more like it belongs with the rest of the OG classic games, especially because it's the second game in the Sonic and Tails series that started with Sonic Chaos in 1993, which is squarely in the classic era. So I think nowadays I'm leaning towards calling Knuckles Chaotix the start of the Awkward Era. Be sure to let me know in the comments what your personal eras of Sonic are. Maybe you group them by the decade they came out in. 2010 Sonic, 2000 Sonic, 1990 Sonic, etc. Although for some reason, putting Sonic 1, Sonic R, and Sonic Adventure all in the same era just makes me want to barf. Maybe you put the games in eras based on the console generation they came out in. So Genesis era, Saturn era, Dreamcast era, 7th generation era, and so on. This is another one that's pretty straightforward, but then again, the years when console generations begin and end tend to be pretty debatable, so even that has its problems. It was easier when Sega was making consoles, since you could just use those console release dates as cutoff points. But even that has its issues, because then you have to take into account the fact that, especially with the older Sonic games occasionally have different release dates depending on the country or region. Maybe you think that there were only two Sonic eras: Classic from 1991 to 1998, and Modern from 1998 to the present. Who knows, if Sonic Boom had been a massive success, then we could still be in a third era right now that started in 2014. Now, there are probably some of you watching this video saying this whole idea of eras in Sonic is pointless and this whole video is stupid. Yes, you're correct. But I think it's fun to look back on Sonic's history and see how the franchise evolved over time. If you're interested in watching more videos where I talk about Sonic history, here's a video I did on the evolution of Sonic Zone title cards. I also have a whole playlist of Sonic videos for you to check out if you're looking for something to marathon or to just have something to listen to as background noise. That's all I've got to talk about for today though, so thanks for watching y'all, and have a great rest of your day.